Thank you for being here.
I will answer your question, but first, if someone said, this is not a silent genocide going on in Pakistan. It's just very, very noisy genocide. And I don't know what the people they define killing or murder. Murder doesn't mean only to end one's life. For a nation, for a people, eliminating their language, eliminating their culture, eliminating their history is more than killing physically. And to me, culture, identity, language, tradition, without these, a people or a nation is without soul. We can observe the phenomena of the indigenous people of America and Australia. They are still living. They can eat, they can drink, they have their houses. But they are dead in a sense that they don't know their language, they don't know about their gods, they don't know about their traditions, they don't know how their ancestors were sometime walking down in their land. So, first, killing is not only physical. Killing involves cultural, economic, historical. Someone was saying that, Ravina was saying, everything in Pakistan is based on lies, including history. They are mutilating our history beyond recognition. So, this is relative because who is running UN? Who are the policy makers of the United Nations? When the West was financing United Nations, the United Nations was observing human rights violation where there is an interest of the Western countries. And now, when China and Saudi Arabia are main contributors to the UN, they see human rights violation where Chinese interests or some vague interest of other people are involved. But it doesn't mean that we should abandon our efforts, the UNHCR or other forums in the United Nations, because we don't have any other option. Whether they listen to us or not, we have to cry. We have to raise our voices. United Nations is not an independent organization. So I think that to move United Nations and in particular, we have to reach out those powers or countries who are controlling the United Nations.
Thank you. Thank you for that. You brought up a lot of interesting points, and it's hard to be a moderator and go in one direction because there's a bunch of different topics I'd like to unpack. You say, we cannot abandon our work because we do not have another option. No matter how hard we sit here and criticize the UN, there's nothing else to do in that regard. There needs to be a awareness needs to be raised. What I would, you know, I know a number of you have been in the field of human rights advocacy for a very long time. Could any of you maybe discuss any development you've seen over, any change, not necessarily development, but change you've seen over time, kind of within this definition of genocide? Dr. Green, please.
So, I absolutely support what other person said, because at the moment UN is dominated by the states which were outcome of World War II, artificial rapid countries which were formed in rush to stabilize the international peace. So I have no problem with it, but it has a problem like people like us who are underrepresented, who are stateless people, right? But as Darcy said, that we have to work within what we have got, right? So yes, I haven't seen the change because I've been working in UN since the age of 20, since 20. I haven't seen change, but recently I've seen a couple of things which I would like to talk to with you team as well. Is that UN General Secretary has got now 2 advisors. One which is called the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide, and then this is a second one, the Special Advisor on the Responsibility to Protect the People. These are the 2 new advisors has been introduced recently. And I think that's about the time for us to, or the people who really genuinely believe in our cause, is to actually lobby those individual advisors or advisors' offices, really. These are the new element has been recently introduced. Again, infiltration is very common. Pakistan, our enemy, is extremely powerful in Geneva, extremely powerful in New York, and extremely powerful in all other institutes in the United Nations. But that doesn't mean we should sit down. We as said, we need your help to lobby the countries who fund the United Nations, for number 1. That is important. And second, that these new instruments and new mechanisms which have been introduced since during the COVID time, we need to actually take those hold. And these are the new mechanisms. So it's really timely that we work on those. There's a third thing has come up, which I heard this morning actually, I visit, is that every year now, human rights report is being published by General Secretary, which takes the 1 year's extrajudicial killing in the recent. And I think if we could mention, especially the Baloch casualties and Sindhi casualties of those reports, it brings its challenges every year to the countries to respond to those atrocities. So there are a few things which we can actually work about problem. But of course, we need to think here strategically. And strategically, Dr. Dashti said, we got to help you guys to help us to lobby those countries who fund. But now, unfortunately, at the moment, the biggest funder of the United Nations is China at the moment. Now, here, let's leave the questions, perhaps we can end on the China road.
I mean, whatever you're comfortable, I have a question for you prepared, but please go ahead.
May I add something on what she said?
If I can, sorry, just to interrupt for a moment, I'll take this opportunity. I forgot to mention it earlier. If you do have a phone, please make sure that it's silenced. Please.
So I think she made such an important impression on me for such questions because as a young person, to me, come to UN is such an honor. I see that because I think I am here to criticize it rather than being a fan of it. What I saw is that when I came here, what I had in my mind was completely different what I saw today in an event that was named for enforced disappearance. What I thought was, of course, diplomats sitting there with their perfect suits. I did kind of imagine that. But what I imagined is also a youth representation. Because we're talking about the future. The youth that is the future. I didn't see any youth representation in any panels. And when we talk about the enforced disappearance, we just gave 1 minute and 30 seconds, I guess. That was the minute to talk about such a violent crime in part of the world that for them it's just 130 seconds. It's the whole life for people. For me to come in such events, I think I'm here to criticize this more than anybody else because I am going to be the future. And I don't want this in the future because I think it's just ridiculous to sit in those tables and give the country's 1 minute and 30 seconds to talk about their issues that is killing their future. If there is no man left in my country and the woman is being raped and killed, who is going to give birth to my next generation? Who I can be a politician for? How am I going to do that? When you talk about that if UN has changed, I have never been before here, but what I see now is it needs to change. It has changed, I don't know, but it needs to change in future at least. Thank you.
Thank you. No, you're making a very good point, and I think we can go further into kind of UN and international legal kind of approaches to these very serious issues. Fanny, if I could go back to you, I'd love to expand more on cultural genocide and that term, applying it to your case study, Tibet. I would also be curious to know about kind of, you once again touched on women's rights within this cultural genocide context, young women's rights, and how that, how they're affected within this kind of strategic, if you could say that, genocide.
So you mentioned the term cultural genocide, and to be honest, I'm not so sure about the use of cultural genocide. The risk is that in addressing cultural genocide, we separate out Tibetans' cultural existence and their biological survival, when in reality both are intertwined. A genocide is a genocide and should be called as such. In my work, I will return to Raphael Lemkin's work. His conception of genocide is very important, as it does not always include the immediate destruction of a nation and its people. It should rather be seen as a process, a coordinated two-step plan of action, aiming first to eradicate the national patterns of the oppressed group, and then to forcibly assimilate this group by the national patterns of the aggressor. The difficulty with the 1948 convention is that its text focuses on mass extermination on the biological level, overlooking King's concept of genocide, and notably the central cultural component of such violence. China has violently disrupted the natural process of cultural change in Tibet through forced cultural assimilation, which continues to engender violence. In Tibet, it implies the forced abandonment of the population to give up their cultural identity, not only their education, spirituality, arts, language, norms, and customs to fit into China's, and the CCP does not hesitate to use violence to achieve its aims. I recall that the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous Peoples prohibited forced assimilation in international law. To prevent such forced cultural assimilation, it is crucial to recall that the CPP must guarantee the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association as enshrined in international human rights law.
No, again, touched on another interesting subject. This cultural genocide, this notion that really hasn't been addressed by institutions like the UN and bodies of international law, is something that we're seeing in all three of the focus areas that you guys are representing today. Dream brought up the fact that an oral submission at a UNHRC session is 1 minute and 30 seconds long, at best. We have meetings, we have Human Rights Council sessions, we have laws like this one. Is that enough to address cultural genocide? What can the international community do to address cultural genocide? And I'm looking at you, Fanny. If you would like to answer, please do.
It's not enough. I think we should. Lemkin was actually one of the initiators of the convention, and he really spoke about cultural genocide and genocide. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, only the biological extermination of people is taken into account, and the cultural component of cultural genocide was just overlooked, completely overlooked, and that was a huge mistake. That's why we see now so many violence that just are committed, just are very genocide, I don't think using the word actually the definition of genocide that should be worked on, and we need to put the cultural component a bit further.
Yeah.
Because it's very missing.
It's terrifying, and culture in itself is such a difficult thing to define. But we're seeing it in, again, all the cases you're bringing here today. What I would like to switch to, who I would like to switch to is Dr. Dashti, if I may. I was wondering if you could expand a bit on kind of your work as an author who's been labeled blasphemous. How does that affect your culture and kind of that of your people? Are these works you publish, are they gone?
So many things is gone from our society, from our tradition. Then we are people, are a nation, which is slowly but noisily being eliminated from the face of earth. We live in an area, 2,000 years ago, there were 7 major nations which were mentioned in Greek authors' reports on this area, who were accompanying Alexander the Great. Now, among those people which they termed as predators, because they resisted the march of the Greek army to the land, they termed them as predator nations. Among those 7 predator nations, only 2 are existing at the moment. One is Kurd, the other is Balouch. All other 5 are vanished. You can't find them in today's world, neither their language. Among these 2, Kurd, they are a little bit fortunate because of the conflict in the Middle East. Willingly or unwillingly, they have got some kind of autonomous region. And they are in a way able to preserve their language and traditions and history. But we, Baloch, we are being finely minced by the powerful jaw of at least 3 religious, fundamentalist and rogue states for decades. In the West, there is Persian Islam. In the East, there is Pakistani Islam, and on the North, it is the Afghan fundamentalism. We can't teach our children Balochi in schools. There is no education for our children in Balochi, neither in Iran, nor in Pakistan, nor in Afghanistan. Our history has been mutilated to an extent that the Persian, they say, the Baloch are a sub-tribe of Persia. Pakistani course books or curriculum in schools and colleges. Until 3 years ago, they defined the Baloch as barbaric, brutal, inhumane group of people. That was in the official curriculum of school curriculum of Punjab, which is in practical terms Pakistan. Then, in any book or curriculum in Iran and Pakistan, there is no mention that Balouch were, until they were occupied by the British in 1839. They were an independent nation. There was a country. They have their own way of life, whether they were poor, but they were walking tall on the deserts and mountains. You can't find any mention of the Balouch in the books. Curriculum. Our language is 3,500 years old, and our children are forced to learn a language which is 400 years old, which was developed in the red light areas and military camps of northern India. And this is our national language. There is nothing wrong with the languages. Languages are the medium of communication. We love each and every language. But it should not be at the expense of our mother tongue. Urdu is not our national language. Our nation is Baloch, and Baloch is our national language. But for the last 75 years, our children are forced to believe that Urdu is their national language. Then there is the mutilation of history. There were in medieval times people from Central Asia, from West Asia. They grouped together, formed armies or bandits. They invaded India. And on the way, they also massacred Balouch. There were genocides of the Balouch until they reached India or the same. And these marauders, these invaders from Central Asia, whether they were Turco-Mongols, whether they were Persians, whether they were Arabs, they carried out genocide on our ancestors. And now our children are being forced to accept them as national heroes. Our children are being forced to write and glorify them in their exam papers. Then there is a cultural difference. Balouch are not Indians. We belong to the cultural traditions of Central Asia or Persian plate. But because of this cultural, linguistic, historical onslaught, now many of our own traditional values are being forcefully kept in the background. And I think if some person who died in 1948 or 47 came again to life, he will not, or she will not recognize where he or she is, whether he or she is in one of the Balouch or from another community. And then there is the economic genocide. Okay.
So if we carry on,
Then this economic genocide, we Balouch believe that our land is rich. We have everything of natural resources. But we are now the poorest of the poor. So all these things, I think that first part of the definition of the genocide, it includes all these things. Killing, whether you kill a language, whether you kill a cultural tradition, whether you mutilate the history of the nation, whether you get economically backward a rich community, all these are killing of people or a genocide.
Thank you. That last point you made before genocide, and economic genocide, was particularly powerful. I sincerely apologize to cut you off. Unfortunately, we're tight on time. I would like to ask for some closing remarks on 3 topics I collected from all 4 of you speaking. And then we have a special guest speaker who will speak briefly as well. But if I may, I really, it's a shame to have to cut this short. Unfortunately, the room is only booked for so much time. But some key points, at least I, and I'm sure our audience took away from you today, which I would then ask for you each to speak on, some of your own closing remarks, is that these genocides we're speaking about today may fall under this definition, but they also may not. But the most important thing to take away is that they are definitely not silent, and there's a very forced erasure of cultural identity, and a forced forgetfulness of that very identity. I would also, I also picked up that we must revisit the international legal definition of genocide and pay closer attention at who is writing these, who are the lawyers writing these laws, who are the international policymakers labeling these different humanitarian atrocities. And finally, moving away from the UN, its institutions and definitions of international law, it's very clear that there is a state of human rights that is simply unacceptable. Not only is it unacceptable, that the very basic needs of women in each individual kind of groups is unacceptable as well, in which you cannot speak on the very fundamental needs. So these are my 3 points. I would be grateful if each of you could kind of offer some closing remarks. Maybe Fanny, we can start with you and come down the line.
Yes, I was very often asked about the role of the CCP, why they actually go through such repression in Tibet. And I don't think it's possible to know exactly what the intent of the CCP is, what do they have in mind. But what we could see is that through its actions, policies, laws, the CCP is destroying in whole or in part the Tibetan people. The CCP denies Tibetans the right to live in Tibet. I would like to conclude with Lemkin, who explains that the destruction of a society or a nation, I quote, results in the loss of its future contributions to the world. Moreover, such destruction offends our feelings of morality and justice in much the same way as does the criminal killing of a human being. I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fanny. It was very resonant to many of our cases as well. But I just want to be very clear that when it comes to the case for a traditional definition of genocide, we Sindhis and of course Baloch fit in very well. Even for the killing part, unfortunately, the extrajudicial killing is so prevalent in both nations that it doesn't need even the other forms of definition. So I wanted to really emphasize that before we going in other parts of the definition, we just hit on the thing. It should be an international investigation that how many people are disappeared, how many people are killed in Sindh and Balochistan. But also, I mean, a systematic eradication and erosion of the cultures and nations is a classic example. For example, the Sindh is currently going through some of the worst flooding in Pakistan, a humanitarian crisis. And this is the second time. After 2010, we had the same flooding, but it's a double now at the moment. Around 10 to 20 million people are affected. And it's not climate change. That the way Pakistan has presented is a climate change. It's not climate change. It's a poor management of Pakistani state who actually got the funds from 2010, completely went to the military. They did not spend on infrastructure. They did not improve the drainage system, and they did not provide adequate rescue system. Till today, after 6 weeks of flooding, people are still stranded, and Pakistan has got one of the richest army in the world, still not provided the jets or helicopters to those people. And people are dying with hunger, people are dying with the diseases. Is that genocide? It is genocide. It's a clear, obvious genocide. We don't need to get into another definition. I don't need to present another case for it. I'm just saying it, go into traditional form, and this is my case, and please help us out. Thank you.
Period. Thank you. Thank you. Jean.
Just to remember that why we are here today is that the genocide, just to remember the last 4 months, what happens in Balochistan. In April, 39 people were killed and 50 disappeared. And in May, it was 45 women and children and 20 killed. And then in June, it was 33 killed, 30 disappeared. In July, 40 disappeared, 48 killed. And in August, this last month, 30 killed and 36 disappeared. Do you think it's not it's a silent genocide? For me, it's definitely not. And just for that, she mentioned a lot of things are happening right now. For that definition happened, I don't know, in after World War II. And then when you remember that R2P, that is his responsibility to protect, that I think is important to know that the definition of that is an international norm that seeks to ensure that international community never again fails to halt the mass atrocity crimes of genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Are we seeing again for this? Is it happening right now? Or what are we doing right now? We need help. The governments are not helping. The Pakistan army is actually doing it because they want us to die. They want us to die and call it a climate change disaster, an extreme natural disaster. And we're not ready to accept that. I want to tell you today that it's not a climate change extreme, and it's properly systematic, planned genocide that is happening via the name of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Dashti, we will close this off.
I think there are two things. One is that the genocide, taking note of the genocide in our area or in another part of the world, is relative to the political interest of the powerful. It is not an isolated issue. Where there are interests of the powerful, a single event. There was a child who drowned on the beaches of Syria. There was an outcry which the world has never seen before, especially the Western world. Because they were trying to topple the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. And this they used not in the love of the Syrian people of the Kurdish guy. That was used as a political weapon to mobilize their masses, to make the public opinion in favor of intervention in Syria. So we should not put many hopes on these institutions. But as I said before, we have no other options. And we have to knock at the doors repeatedly, persistently. Perhaps things will change. Perhaps they may find some interest in our region, economic or strategic, and then they will take up the issue of our genocide. Otherwise, it will go on.
Maybe if I could invite the audience to